Hi, everybody. Welcome back. My name is Carol Williams, and with me I have Graham Keith. Welcome, Graham.
Thank you, Karen. Pleasure to be here, as always.
And it is a pleasure to have you back. For those of you who do not know Graham, he was previously interviewed on my blog last year, and I will include a link to that interview down below. But for those who don't know you, Graham, how about you give a brief introduction?
Okay, yep, Graeme Keith, based in Copenhagen, so it's late here, despite being middle of the day where Carol is. Um, I'm the quant guy, so I do anything associated with quantification. I've kind of started broadening it a little bit. I've started calling it structural analytics associated with risk management, because some of what we do isn't sort of strictly quantitative in the sense that it's not necessarily coming up with numbers. It can also be looking at sort of ways that the things are structured, and trying to sort of interrogate those structures to find out some interesting things about the way that our risks and controls and various things are hanging together. So, I mean, definitely everything to do with quantification. That's me, and also looking into these sort of graph theoretical, network theoretical approaches as well. Background in applied math. I have a PhD in applied math. Worked a number of different places in a number of different roles. Probably the key ones, I was head of strategy and head of enterprise risk management at Maersk Oil, which was a sort of mid-cap oil and gas company. And I was vice president of quantitative risk at Archer. So I've also been a little bit on the vendor side as well. Now consulting independently, independent advisor. And essentially anybody who's looking to use quantitative methods or analytical methods in their risk management, enterprise risk, or managing risks more locally, I'm your guy.
Fantastic. And I will also include your LinkedIn profile and your company profile page linked below. So please go follow him, connect with him, and follow all the great stuff that Graham puts out there for everybody. Thank you, Graham. Okay, so today we are going to talk about risk taxonomy, aka risk categories. You and I had a fascinating conversation on this one,
Carol, we've
and we
got
were
to get
like,
out more. We really do. It's just like, oh, wrist taxonomy, let's go.
it's so true. Okay, so we geeked out on a
Yeah,
conversation about risk
totally.
taxonomy,
Yeah.
risk categories, and we decided that we needed to share it with the world.
Mm.
So that is what the purpose of this conversation is all about. Um, so let's just start from the very beginning. Risk taxonomy. I tend to call it risk categories because taxonomy has a meaning of words and language and things, and categories is a very specific subset of that. Would you agree
Mm.
with that?
No, absolutely, absolutely. Yep.
Okay. So I'm just going to call it risk categories from here on
Hmm.
out to keep it really simple for everybody. Um, but I would like for you to share what your view is of when a company is setting up risk categories and what they need to consider.
Yeah. I mean, it's a great question, and I think I think it's a fair question for your listeners to say, well, why is Carol asking the quant guy about taxonomies and categorization? And I think, the reason we sort of had this conversation, when you do quantification, and when I talk about quantification, I'm not talking about modeling risk. We're not talking about anything sort of terribly sophisticated. All we're doing is taking what people usually use heat maps for, and then we're just introducing this very, 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 very simple quantitative assessment. I mean, methodology is almost too much. It's just replacing the questions you ask when you're filling out a heat map with very, very simple questions that align with a very, very simple model, which means that the people who now do heat maps can do this very simple quantitative assessment. But what it does is it does two things. One is it allows you to really understand how much your risks are costing you. Obviously, there's uncertainty around that, and we're trying to capture that uncertainty, but how much they're costing you. And then it has a much more robust method of aggregating risk. And that's where the whole taxonomy categorization hierarchy thing comes in, because when you start adding risks together, so you have a risk register, all your risks are assigned to different categories. One of the very natural questions to ask is which kind of risk is giving me the most headache? Where is my risk exposure coming from? So you'd like to look across your risk landscape and understand where the hotspot is, where the problems are coming from. And so what you're doing is you're adding all your cyber risk together, and you're adding all your compliance risk together, and you're adding all your legal risk together, and all the rest of it. And then you're looking at how those things compare. Now, when you do that in a sort of heat map context, those aggregations are always a little bit uncomfortable for various reasons, and I think people don't take them sort of massively seriously, which is right because they don't really work. But when you do quantification and the quantitative assessment methodology, suddenly those things mean something. Um, and I think it sort of forces a discipline that you maybe can get away with not necessarily having so much when you're in that kind of qualitative or semi-quantitative framework. Um, that kind of leads me into sort of what I'm thinking about when I'm doing this. Whenever I'm doing any kind of modeling or any kind of quantitative anything or analytical anything, the starting point for that whole conversation, that whole process, everything is what are we using this for? What's the point? Why are we doing this? So why are we having a risk taxonomy? Or sorry, we weren't going to call it. Why are we categorizing our risks? And the reason we're categorizing our risks, so that's kind of question number one is why are we doing this? And the next question is what decisions are we supporting? And the decisions we're supporting here are where should we spend our money? Where can we save money? So what we're trying to do is we're trying to understand, okay, we want to look across the landscape, we want to understand where the exposure is, and we want to understand, can we invest in some of these places to reduce exposure? Are there maybe some areas where everything's kind of very nicely under control? Maybe we're spending too much in an area. Maybe we can save some money in one place, spend some more money in other places. And what that means is that it's important that your whatever you use to categorize is aligned with the decision levers that you have. So if you're sitting there at an enterprise level and your decision levers are about allocation of budget, should I spend money on, phishing training for cyber risk, or should I install sprinklers in all my warehouses? That decision that the analysis is supporting needs to be aligned with your decision structure. So it's a very natural thing to do to align them to either the functional leadership that is managing those areas, or to budget. How do we distribute budget between these areas? Very often those are the same thing, and I think that's really a key principle there is making sure that when you set up the taxonomy, you use the taxonomy gives you insight, gives you some clarity, gives you some overview. That's going to lead to some decisions. You want to make damn sure that the decisions that you're supporting are decisions you're actually able to make.
Right. Okay. So thank you for that. I think that was extremely helpful for everybody because I think what a lot of people forget is that um, risk can be tagged with a variety of things, whether they can be linked to a business function or to a category or to an objective. Like there's a lot of things that you can link to that you don't have to choose one or the other. You can link to all of these things, and these provide an additional way of breaking things down to understand how they're grouped. So
Yes.
if you're, you can say, what are the risks to this objective? And they cross multiple risk categories and multiple business functions, right? What are the risks in this category? They can cross multiple objectives, multiple functions, same thing, right? So going across the board.
Exactly. Exactly.
But you can,
Exactly.
but you can also get into analysis paralysis, right? And
Okay.
figuring out how many different categories should we
Yeah.
have.
Yeah.
And
Which is
so
why, yeah, which is why the primary driver for all of this is what is the decision I'm supporting, and if it's not supporting a decision, don't do it. And really, you're sitting there saying, and very often, some sort of it's very normal to have some sort of risk categorization, because you want to be making those sorts of decisions about prioritizing maybe risk areas or specific risks. It's also very normal to have some sort of business operations, often budget prioritization, because you want to be making sure you understand who is responsible for your main areas of risk. So there's a sort of responsibility. It can be budget, so it's like who's spending money, who's potentially saving money, but also who is responsible for these areas of risk. Beyond that, you've really got to understand what it is you want to use it for. I mean, some people do products, which is interesting. So you can say, okay, which of my products are exposed, and that's a good thing to understand. In a cyber risk context, you very often do assets and applications again and that's a sort of obvious, where do I need to protect? But again, all of these things, they have to be aligned with the decision that you want to make and that you're going to do something about. And you're right. I mean, I see a lot of people just categorizing all sorts of things for all sorts of reasons, and it doesn't really help. I should say, and maybe I'm anticipating a question here, but I'll just pile on anyway. I should say, when you do this, you're absolutely right. You can attach risk to different structures. and those structures cross each other, and that's interesting, and that's one of the beauties. I mean, the really nice thing when you have a sort of this quantitative assessment methodology set up is this sort of ability to slice and dice. So you can filter down on a business unit and see how their risks are spread out, or you can look at the whole company and say how this risk distributes between risk categories, or you can look at a risk category and see how it splits out across business units, and all these sorts of things. And it's great, and it's really good fun, and it's extremely insightful. It's very useful. Sorry, there's a huge dogfight going on the street at the moment. I don't know if you can hear it. Um,
Yep.
but it's important that when you are attaching to one structure, and it's a decision structure, you can only attach to one place. If you start attaching to multiple places in the same structure, then you're getting into trouble because you're going to be counting the same risk once or twice. Um, and that kind of so your structures need to be mutually exclusive. You need to be able to put a risk in one place and one place only, and they need to be exhaustive. You need to be able to put everything somewhere. Um, the mutual exclusivity sometimes generates issues. So I'll have clients say to me, "Oh, but look, this risk belongs in these two places," and that's actually really, really interesting because when you're having that conversation, you're saying, "Well, okay, fine." But then you run the risk that you've got two people looking after the same risk. And that could easily end up in a situation where one is saying, oh, they're looking after it. And they're saying, oh, no, 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 they're looking after it. So you have that sort of
Mhm.
falling between the chairs thing, or you're wasting resources having two people managing the same risk. So if you have two people managing the same risk, that is a conversation you absolutely want to surface. And that's one of the beauties of sort of applying your mind to building these structures in a meaningful way. Something I think the quantification kind of pushes you into doing, and that's where a lot of the value comes out is the conversations that it surfaces.
Yeah. Completely agree with you. And you actually had a very interesting point that I want to tie back to, and that was the fall between the chairs. I love that saying. That's fantastic. I would call that accountability, right? So that's your accountability not at work if you
Hmm.
have multiple people assigned to it. And we've talked about that on our risk owners articles about you need a single risk owner, and maybe you have somebody that's working on a mitigation for that risk. That is not the owner of the risk. You have one owner of the risk. But if you do try to assign it to multiple categories, the mutual exclusive, then you start running into, well, hold on. Does that mean that the risk is actually too broad? Have we identified a risk that is too broad? It has multiple root causes. Then that's not the same risk. You have two different root causes. That is two distinct risks. Separate the two. They may have a similar consequence, but the root cause is separate. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I no, I agree, and I think you're right that that is again a very insightful conversation that arises when you start trying to be a little bit disciplined about assigning to these categories. Um, I think you have to make a choice with whether you're assigning according to consequence or assigning according to cause. And you can do both. I mean, but then you get a lot of risks because then you'll have, you know, you might have a one risk that has four different causes, and then that comes out as four different risks, and if it has four different consequences, then you're looking at all the combinations. So you kind of you need to sort of think it through, but you also you need to be pragmatic about it. I tend to go with consequences rather than causes. And I'm not saying this is dogmatic. You know, and this I think it changes from situation to situation, and very often your taxonomies are given to you by regulations anyway, so you don't have a lot of choice in the matter. But if I can do it, I tend to be thinking about to building structures according to consequence. Partly because a lot of this, I mean, it sounds a very cynical way of thinking about it, and it is a bit, but in a sense, it's a little bit, okay, this goes wrong. Who are we going to blame? Like, where are we going to land this, right? You know, whose fault is this? Or who should have been looking after? Or who's going to look after the consequences when it goes wrong? And that's a sort of slightly dark way of looking at it. But in a sense, it's not a bad idea as a sort of thought experiment. And that leads you very naturally to consequences because what you're doing is you're saying, okay, it's gone wrong. I'm looking at the consequences. I want to assign consequences you know, these ownerships are assigned according to consequence. But I think the other thing and we tend to forget this, I think, in a sort of big operational context. We really want to be thinking about objectives, and I know this is something you talk about a lot, and something you're very, very consistent about evangelizing. Um, and the thing is, when you're looking at operational risk, the objectives are just it's costing you money. You don't want to lose more money than you have to. So in that sense, it's kind of less complicated than it is in other contexts. But it's worth kind of keeping those things in mind. And what you tend to want to do from a when you're sort of building these structures, obviously you're aligning with the decision levers. That's a very important principle. What you often find is the decision levers are aligned with a breakdown of the value generating processes that generate the value that gives you your objectives. So working so that's something else that I like to do is to sort of start with the objective, just very simply, okay, we want to make some money. Great. We need some revenue, which means we need to produce something, we need to sell it, and we're looking at price. And then you've got all sorts of things that influence that. And then you've got, as you work back from those things, you understand the processes that you have that generate value and the processes you have that protect value. And so you very naturally develop these taxonomies that are automatically connected through to objectives. And I think that's a very powerful approach. So all other things being equal, I tend to want to sort of structure things around consequences
No,
rather than
and I would say that you are absolutely correct because I know so many times I'm having conversations with clients or businesses and they naturally gear themselves towards, well, yeah, this could happen, but it could have five different consequences.
mm, mm,
Okay, well,
mm.
let's talk about that because we need to figure out how to separate. Well, how does that impact this objective? How does this other thing impact this other objective? Well,
Yeah,
now you're talking about that natural split
yeah,
between risks because
yes,
if it affects multiple objectives, you need to split that out
yes,
because the impact on those individual objectives will be different. Yes, it
yes,
could impact, but the impact is different.
yeah,
Okay, so that also brings to another point of there are a lot of, well, I don't want to quantify this, no pun intended, but there are people that talk about, well, we have uh, multiple tiers of risk categories.
mm, mm,
And so trying to figure out, well, how deep should you go
hmm,
into this tiering methodology
yeah,
of, we have level one category, level two category, level three categories. Holy smokes, how detailed are you going to get?
yeah.
So, what would you say, especially considering the analysis part of this, how deep should they go and where should you stop,
Yeah,
really?
yeah. I mean, again, all of these questions, the answer starts with what is the decision you're supporting. I mean, if you're going down into a level of granularity that isn't supporting a decision, if you can't do anything with that information because you don't have the decision levers to act on it, don't do it. Um, so that's one consideration. I think another is so there's two things. I think one thing that you do. mm, okay, we'll say one thing first. The further you go down, the harder it is to keep the mutual exclusivity. If you get into a lot of granularity, then it gets very, very difficult to assign risk to just one place. So I think that's part of what is that's part of what controls that mechanism when you sort of bring it down. So it's partly do you have decision levers, but it's also um, are you able to keep things mutually exclusive if you go down to that level of granularity? Um, it's something I think one wants to do, and I have a nice example from time working in the oil company. We had helicopter accidents, right? And the helicopter accident, that's quite a level of granularity. So you sort of, you're sort of safety, and then you're in sort of site safety or transport, and then you're down into helicopter accidents. You think, okay, so that's not really, it's not so much a sort of, it's not, you can think of it as the last leg in a sort of increasing granularization of the risk categories, or you can think of it as a sort of type of risk. So it's not a risk because it's not owned. It only becomes a risk when it's instantiated in all the different places where you're flying helicopters, because those are the places where you have somebody who's responsible for looking after that and making sure that things are, the rules are followed and all the rest of it. But at the same time, you might want to do something like, okay, I want to look at helicopter safety across this large company, and I want to compare that to cyber risk, for example, which is much less sort of locally owned. It's much more of a sort of corporate level exposure. But in order to be able to do that, I need to be able to have a category so I can find all these things and bring them all together and I can add them all up. Um, and that again is a it goes back to this issue around, okay, is this something I want to make a decision about? So to the underlying principle is do you have a decision lever? Do you have a decision to make around this? And if you have decisions to make around individual risks, then sure, bring them into that categorization so you can capture them. If you don't, leave it out. Try to get the granularity so that you can maintain that mutual exclusivity and keep it at the level where you can actually make decisions. And I had another point, but it's escaped me. Damn. Never mind. It'll come back to me, I'm sure.
Okay. No, I love how you keep going back to there. Is there a decision to be made around this? Because it's a great grounding question. I think as practitioners, we tend to get lost in the weeds of a lot of these other concepts without coming back to these grounding questions.
Absolutely.
So I think having it be what is the objective that the business is trying to achieve so that we can say, well, what are the risks to those objectives? And then, okay, is there a decision we made around this when it comes to all these different points around assignment of a category, assignment of an owner, assignment, delegating or identifying controls to a risk? Like, to go through all of that effort, you need to first ask if there's a decision to be made. If there
Absolutely.
isn't, why should we go through this process?
Absolutely. And I'm going to say true, and my but is going to bring me back to the point that I forgot to make in the last one because it went out of my head, but now it's come back into my head. The point I was going to make before was the issue around top down, bottom up, right? So to an extent, you want to build these structures because you want, at some level, you want to make sure that you have a consistency of coverage between all the different places that you're assessing your risks. And you want to make sure that you covered all the things that you've identified in that value generating process. So everything you've talked about, working back from objectives, value generating, all of those things, you want to make sure those decks are covered. And everything you just said, 100%, that is absolutely very much part of the process. Thinking about the value, thinking about the decisions, thinking about protecting value, generating value, all of those things. At the same time, we need to have a bit of humility. We need to recognize that as we sit there in our little ivory tower in headquarters and we look out over this large organization that might have operations in all sorts of different places around the world, the people sitting in all those different places around the world, they have a much better idea of what's going to knock them off course than we do. So you also want to be able to sort of bring it in the other way, if you like. So you want to be able to sort of specify these things down to a certain extent, all of those processes that we've just talked about, but you also want to give people the opportunity to say, hey, in this part of the world, I have this issue and I need that to be captured. So I think you also, while you have all this structure and while you have all this sort of, yes, everything's driven by decisions, I think you also need to recognize that you need to give people a microphone, just give them the mic and say, okay, what have you got here? And it might be that you look at it and say, yeah, I get that you're upset about that because that happened to you last year. But actually, when we look at it in the big scheme of things, it's not such a big deal. But it can very well be the case where somebody says, oh, "Hey, I've got this issue," and you think, "Okay, that's something I hadn't thought about. We need to build that into our system," and that's generating a decision. So, I guess what I'm saying is, when you do this whole business around objectives, decisions, understanding everything in between, nothing's set in stone. The objectives can evolve, but also the decisions can evolve as well, and those structures evolve accordingly. And so you need to keep that sort of flexibility. And I think humility is actually a really key part of that. It's not thinking that you know everything. You've got to be able to kind of let people come to you with what it is that's upsetting them.
Oh, and I completely agree with that. I think of us as being facilitators of conversations. We know the right questions to ask, and we have a general framework in which is best to look at things.
Hmm.
But every situation is different, every organization is different, and the needs of that organization are different. And the way that leadership wants to receive information is different. And
Yes,
you have to massage this way of doing things to fit all of those different circumstances,
absolutely,
for sure.
100%. Yes.
Okay, so all of those things have been fantastic. Now, there's one other question I have, and that is, I've I've had conversations and heard of people that want to use risk categories instead of risk statements, right? And when it comes to saying, well, we've got 10 risks. And I'm like, you have 10 risks? That's it? That's all you got? And what it ends up being is, oh, they've got risk categories. Okay.
Yeah.
And they're assessing risk categories
Hmm.
without driving any deeper.
Yes.
How does that affect the assessment of risk when it comes to being able to truly understand the risk?
Yeah, uh, that's a really interesting question, and you're absolutely right. You see this a lot, and when people, yeah, they come to you and they have their tiny little risk registers, and really it's about categorizations of risk. Look, I think, I'm not sure how many years ago. Let's say 10 years ago. 10 years ago, I'd have been quite sort of dogmatic and said, no, 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 no. You have to be, understanding, how these risks play out in all of the different areas and all of these different things. But I think, I've spoken to an immense number of people who are doing this in all sorts of different companies, in all sorts of sectors, in all sorts of places around the world, and everyone does it differently, and they do it at different levels. I think if you're sitting there with those 8 risk categories or 10 risk categories or whatever it is, and you're sitting there in your headquarters in your ivory tower and you're trying to figure out what they mean, you have to recognize that there is an immense amount of expertise and information around the organization that you're not leveraging in doing that. And
Hmm.
it's not to say that you can't do something interesting and you can't maybe acquire some sort of insight from looking at those things. Um, but I think if you really want to sort of, turn around to your investors or turn around to your regulator and say, I am in control of my risk, you have a bit of a credibility gap if you're just sitting there saying, I've got these categories, these are my categories. Because I mean, then you may as well just ask ChatGPT. I'm a whatever company. What are my risks? And it will give you those categories, and it'll probably give you a whole bunch of data that will kind of support those, and that's kind of it. But that's not interesting because that's what everybody has, and what's really interesting about your risk is what you have that's different from everybody else. Because the stuff that everybody has is kind of sort of regulated to a certain extent anyway. What's really interesting, where risk ought to earn its money, is where you're doing something that's different from everybody else. And in order to do that, you really seem to be reaching out into the organization and trying to leverage that insight and that information.
Yeah, no, and I completely agree with that. I would say, as a little twist on it, is that every organization, while there may be similar objectives, say if you're in the same industry, you're all trying to do the same thing, but your method in which you go about doing those things will
Yeah.
all be different, which means your risks are different
Right.
than
Exactly.
company B. So
Yes.
that's
Exactly.
why it's important to drill down to the
Yeah.
next level
Yes.
beyond the categories, as otherwise you don't get that difference.
Yes. 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 100%.
Cool. So, is there anything else that you would like to share as we wrap up?
No, but I do think, Carol, we should try and have a conversation one day where we don't agree on everything and then we have a big fight about something. Don't you think that would be fun?
We
Because I
might
mean,
be able
great
to come up with
conversation.
that.
Very much enjoyed the conversation, but it was a little bit. Oh yeah, this, and it's like, yeah, 100% agree. And it's not because we're making it up. We do actually agree on these things. But I think we should try and find something that we disagree on wildly, and then we can have a fight in front of everyone. That could be really good fun.
Okay. All right. Let's work on that. We can do that. I'm sure. I'm
Okay,
sure there is some topic that we don't agree on, Graham.
we'll try and find one. We'll try and find one.
All right. Well, thank you again for joining us and sharing your knowledge, your perspective with our community. That has been fantastic. And where else can people find you to follow you besides LinkedIn? Because I know you publish on a couple other different places,
No,
right?
LinkedIn is kind of it for the time being.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, and also, I mean, there are other places, but they are linked from LinkedIn. So LinkedIn is actually the go-to
Okay. Go
for
to
stuff around
LinkedIn,
sustainability.
everybody. Find his
Yeah,
profile down below and feel free to say that you saw this interview. And that way he'll know exactly where you came from. So
wonderful.
thank you again, Graham. It's
No,
been
thank
a
you.
pleasure.
Always a pleasure, Carol. Thank you very much, Dee. Thanks for having me.